Historians reviewing the parish archives of St. Landry often point to the summer of 1856 as the season when the Kincannon estate first appeared in local reports, for reasons that had nothing to do with harvests. The earliest notation, filed by a junior clerk whose initials remain illegible, describes a planter exhibiting signs of profound muscular rigidity. Though the document offers no cause, later correspondence between physicians in the region suggests that Rowan Kincannon's decline began weeks earlier, triggered not by injury, but by repeated ingestion of contaminants. Those early letters, preserved in brittle folders at the Atchafalaya Historical Office, adopt the tone of professionals flummoxed by a case that refused to behave according to the rules they knew. Even in those first references, there is the sense that Rowan was already a doomed man, long before anyone could articulate why. What makes these documents especially striking is the consistency with which they imply inevitability. In a ledger kept by Reverend Aldous Merrion, who visited the plantation shortly before Kincannon's symptoms became impossible to disguise, there is a brief line noting that the master seemed confident beyond reason, as though daring misfortune to approach. Merrion's phrase has been quoted often because, in retrospect, it reads like a footnote to fate. Kincannon moved through the world with the conviction of someone who believed consequences were for lesser men. To scholars studying the case, this attitude frames every later event, transforming what initially appears to be an isolated medical tragedy into the closing act of a life built on precarious foundations. By the time Kincannon's collapse entered the official record, the plantation itself had already begun attracting rumors that drifted from trading posts to river docks. A boatman interviewed decades later recalled hearing that the master had been consuming bread that worked against him, a strangely poetic phrasing that resurfaces in several unrelated oral histories. While none of these accounts identify the source of the contamination, they agree on its cumulative nature, each meal carrying him further along a path he could not see. This pattern of slow deterioration, repeated again and again by those who observed him at a distance, shaped the folklore that developed around his final weeks. The man most feared on the southern fringe of the Atchafalaya wetlands had, without realizing it, invited something into his body that unraveled him from within. As the documentary trail widens, later reports adopt a more forensic tone. Dr. Lyle Charbonneau, writing in a private letter now stored in Baton Rouge, remarked that Kincannon's rigidity appeared not spontaneous, but earned, an odd phrase that scholars still debate. Charbonneau had not examined Rowan personally, yet his remark implies a physician's intuition that the illness was bound to the man's conduct. This correspondence, dated early autumn of the same year, indicates that by the time word reached him, the story already carried moral undertones. People spoke of the master's suffering as if it were an expected outcome, the final proof that a life of coercion and grasping ambition had limits. That sentiment saturates the surviving testimonies, a belief that the illness did not simply arrive, but answered something. Some testimonies, particularly those recorded many years after the fact, emphasize how abruptly Rowan's authority evaporated once his health faltered. A field hand interviewed during the Works Progress Administration era described hearing that the master's voice lost its edge long before his body buckled, as if the symptoms began in the intangible parts of him. Although such accounts cannot be verified, they contribute to the growing impression that observers interpreted his decline, not medically, but narratively. The fall of a man who had once kept entire families in fear became a communal parable, retold with varying degrees of accuracy. The broader arc remained the same. Something in his daily routine was undoing him, and those close to the estate could sense it before he did. The earliest surviving plantation journal referencing the deterioration does so with a single, almost dismissive entry. Master unwell. The handwriting, believed to belong to the overseer before Harlan Rusk assumed the position, offers no elaboration. Yet this understated notation marks the official start of the crisis. From a structural viewpoint, it functions as the moment when private decay becomes administratively real, a shift that historians find significant. Such a tonal understatement, paired with the gravity of later events, invites interpretation. Many scholars theorize that the staff recognized his condition as a turning point, but lacked either the vocabulary or the permission to record the truth plainly. As reports accumulated, each one more dramatic than the last, a pattern emerged in how witnesses described Rowan's state. None mention external wounds, accidents, or the kind of physical trauma commonly associated with sudden infirmity. Instead, the accounts focus on his movements, first awkward, then strained, then sharply constrained, as though invisible threads were drawing him inward. While not clinically precise, these descriptions align with what modern specialists recognize as progressive muscular contraction. The absence of a clear cause in the testimonies gave rise to speculation, particularly among later researchers who examined the estate's environmental conditions and food storage practices. By late summer, the gossip had reached nearby settlements, carried by traders who frequented the river routes. One merchant, quoted in a memoir published nearly half a century later, claimed that Rowan's jaw seemed to clench when no words were spoken, a detail that aligns eerily with medical records compiled retrospectively. Even if embellished, the remark demonstrates how quickly the master's strangeness became public knowledge. His deterioration was no longer an internal household matter, but a curiosity discussed in taverns and on ferry landings. The tension in these reports increases noticeably as the date of his collapse approaches, each account presenting his condition as both pitiable and deserved. The Louisiana State University collection preserves a set of notes written by an unnamed bookkeeper who visited the plantation on business shortly before the crisis peaked. The notes describe a man straining to maintain authority over his own posture, a phrasing that suggests denial more than illness. This detail illustrates how Rowan attempted to perform control, even as his body contradicted him. Scholars frequently point to this contradiction as emblematic of his broader life. A man determined to project mastery, unaware that the forces undermining him had already surpassed his reach. These notes also mention minor tremors observed at the dinner table, which the bookkeeper interpreted as impatience rather than pathology. Tension escalates sharply in the final cluster of pre-collapse documents. A neighbor whose farm bordered the Kincannon property reported seeing Rowan ride out toward the old storage sheds, only to dismount abruptly, gripping the saddle as if combating a spasm. This observation, dated just days before his dramatic breakdown, represents one of the last external sightings before the estate sealed itself under the weight of calamity. Later interviews with residents from that area recall how the sight of the master pausing mid-ride circulated rapidly, becoming yet another sign that something was unraveling behind the house's shutters. By this stage in the archival record, Rowan's future appears foreclosed. Every surviving note, letter, and anecdote, even from those who disliked him, carries a tone of inevitability rather than shock. Culminating interpretations from historians view these converging testimonies as evidence that his decline was universally understood as retribution long before any investigation began. The man who had once held absolute sway over the estate seemed, in the eyes of his community, to have entered a reckoning he could neither anticipate nor escape. The final document associated with this early phase is a fragment of correspondence from a river captain who transported goods past the estate that year. He wrote that lanterns stayed lit in the main house at hours when the household usually slept, and he interpreted this as signs of turmoil within the Kincannon walls. Although secondary, this account offers a haunting image of a household trying in vain to conceal internal collapse. It stands as the last marker of the prelude, after which events would accelerate beyond concealment and force every participant in Rowan Kincannon's world to confront the consequences of long-standing decisions. In retrospect, this sequence of documents, spanning letters, journals, testimonies, and fragments, forms a mosaic of a man who had already crossed a threshold without recognizing it. Each report, no matter how mundane, contributes to the impression that Rowan's fate was shaped not in a moment of catastrophe, but through countless small acts accumulating over time. His undoing was not sudden. It was a procession. And all the evidence suggests that by the time the region began whispering about him, the forces working against him had already claimed the final word. Researchers examining family correspondence from the lower Atchafalaya corridor routinely cite Rowan Kincannon's letters to his cousin in Opelousas as evidence of a planter attempting to maintain illusions well past their expiration. In one such letter, dated early June of 1856, he describes himself as enjoying prosperity beyond expectation. Yet the ledger preserved alongside the letter contradicts every boast. The columns reveal mounting credit extended by merchants, postponed payments to contractors, and exaggerated claims of future harvests. This disparity between language and numbers has become central to historical studies of the estate. Rowan behaved as though outward confidence could reshape economic reality. His estate's appearance, fresh paint on the facade, polished silver in the dining room, functioned as a mask concealing a structure already straining under financial pressure. Visitors during that period remarked upon the tension between Rowan's flamboyant gestures and the quieter signals of deterioration around him. An insurance surveyor, who inspected nearby properties that same year, wrote a private note observing that Kincannon rode with ceremony, but kept glancing toward the accounts book practically hidden beneath his coat. This detail, trivial on its surface, illustrates the degree to which he enacted authority, even as his debts expanded. The plantation, positioned near a waterway feeding into the Bayou Teche, had once held strategic value, but shifts in trade routes had left it increasingly isolated. Rowan's lifestyle, however, had not adjusted to this new landscape. Testimonies from laborers later interviewed suggest he spent his evenings performing grandeur while his creditors multiplied. Evidence uncovered in parish court files further illuminates the precariousness of Rowan's situation. A creditor from New Orleans filed a formal complaint that summer, noting persistent delays and unkept assurances, language that hints at a man navigating insolvency with charm rather than payment. What makes this file particularly valuable is the attached statement from a broker who had visited the Kincannon estate earlier that spring. He wrote that the master spoke of liquidating certain assets, an ambiguous phrase scholars now interpret as preparation to sell human property to preserve the estate. Although the file avoids specifics, it foreshadows Rowan's calculated intent long before it became explicit. By mid-June, Rowan's desperation began to seep into his daily interactions. A surviving memorandum from a merchant in Franklin, recorded shortly after a contentious meeting with Kincannon, refers to him as a gentleman cornered by obligations of his own making. The merchant notes Rowan's insistence on purchasing imported fabrics, despite owing substantial sums to multiple suppliers. Modern historians analyzing the memorandum argue that Rowan was constructing an aesthetic of stability. Purchases he could not afford, intended to signal solvency. This behavior mirrors patterns identified in other collapsing plantations of the Gulf region, where material display substituted for genuine financial security. The first major escalation in the archival record comes from a sworn statement by a tradesman who delivered furniture repairs to the estate. He reported that Rowan walked with an elaborate cane, despite showing no signs of injury, interpreting it as an affectation designed to project command. That same statement mentions the master excusing himself repeatedly to scrutinize a bound folder stored beneath his desk. Scholars widely agree that the folder contained the forged deed, placing the estate in his name. The presence of this document, already raising quiet doubts within legal circles, indicates that Rowan understood the fragility of his ownership and monitored any threat that could expose it. Tension grows sharper in accounts from within the house itself. A diary attributed to a young clerk temporarily assisting the local notary records, overhearing a hushed conversation between Rowan and an unidentified associate. In the entry, dated late June, the associate reportedly demanded a payment, while Rowan insisted he would convert the last viable holding within days. Though the diary uses oblique phrasing, most historians interpret viable holding as reference to a human sale. This interpretation is reinforced by later events and gives scholars one of the earliest internal markers of Rowan's plan to sell Ruth Delafay's grandson, Elias, as a means of delaying financial collapse. Newspaper notices from the region that summer reflect how rapidly creditors lost patience. One announcement in the Opelousas Courier lists multiple estates under review for potential asset seizure. Among them, in faded ink, appears the Kincannon property. The listing implies that Rowan had already exhausted informal avenues of negotiation. Records from a meeting between parish officials and outside financiers note his absence, suggesting he avoided gatherings where his financial vulnerability might be probed. This behavior, when placed against his increasingly erratic expenditures, reveals a man choosing fiction over accountability. Another layer of insight into his deteriorating judgment appears in correspondence between two cotton factors in Baton Rouge, who describe hearing Rowan boast of an incoming infusion that would restore his standing. Their letter, dated early July, expresses concern that he might attempt to manipulate inventories or falsify projected yields. Scholars find this correspondence particularly illuminating because it mirrors patterns seen in fraudulent estate operations documented elsewhere in the state. The Kincannon operation was not simply faltering, it was sustained by increasingly unstable calculations. As Rowan's desperation deepened, those working the land began to notice changes in his temperament. A testimony recorded during the Great Depression as part of federal oral history projects notes that Kincannon rode along the fields as if imagining buyers at his back. While the witness could not have known the full circumstances, his recollection aligns with documented visits from debt collectors across early July. Rowan reportedly reacted with hostility when approached to settle even minor accounts. These reactions indicate the psychological toll the layered pressures exerted on him, revealing a man whose composure thinned with each passing week. The next escalation emerges through a letter from a river pilot who occasionally transported goods for the estate. The pilot describes Rowan complaining extensively about being suffocated by calculations, an unusual phrasing that suggests mental strain bordering on collapse. He also notes Rowan's fixation on his ledgers, as though the numbers themselves were antagonists. This description casts the master as increasingly paranoid, a figure monitoring phantom threats while ignoring the tangible financial crisis pressing against his doors. Researchers examining this letter emphasize how Rowan's language resembles that of individuals attempting to maintain control in the face of inevitable loss. By mid-July, the forged deed resurfaces as a significant element in the documentary trail. A clerk in the parish office recorded inconsistencies in the deed's notary seal and quietly flagged it for review. Though no formal action was taken immediately, the clerk's note remained in the file, allowing later scholars to reconstruct the growing administrative suspicion. This discovery casts Rowan's actions during this period in a harsher light. His financial crisis was not merely the result of mismanagement, but hinged on land he had never legally secured. His increasing agitation becomes easier to interpret in this context, revealing a master living under threat from both creditors and the law. In the final surviving notes from this phase, a supply broker recounts Rowan offering vague assurances that he had arranged a sale sufficient to stave off any inquiry. Modern readers understand this to reference the intended sale of Elias, which Rowan believed would provide the funds necessary to satisfy his most aggressive creditor, Mr. Leclerc. The broker's account, written years later but consistent with other evidence, underscores how thoroughly Rowan had tied his future to a transaction that would cost another family its most vulnerable member. That detail forms the bridge to subsequent events, where private schemes collide with household knowledge and set the stage for the unraveling soon to overtake the plantation. By examining these intersecting documents, ledgers, letters, reports, testimonies, scholars have concluded that Rowan's public bravado was inseparable from the collapse taking place behind closed doors. Each step he took to preserve authority drew him further into the web of his own fabrications. The mounting pressure from creditors, the fragile legal standing of the estate, and his planned sale of Elias were not isolated choices, but interconnected threads tightening around him. These threads, once woven together, formed the backdrop against which the next set of events would unfold, drawing members of the household into a conflict that no display of wealth or posture could postpone any longer. Researchers studying domestic labor on antebellum estates often highlight the unique role held by senior cooks, and Ruth Delafay of the Kincannon property is frequently cited as a case study in perceptive authority masked by servitude. A household inventory dated early July of 1856 lists Ruth as responsible for provisioning, scheduling, and managing daily food distribution, duties that placed her at the center of the estate's internal rhythms. Testimonies collected decades later describe her as someone who heard the house breathe, a metaphor that, while poetic, aligns with archival evidence showing she anticipated Rowan Kincannon's movements and moods with uncommon accuracy. Her position granted her access to conversations and objects that bypassed the notice of most individuals living under the master's roof. Correspondence from a visiting seamstress, preserved in a family scrapbook in Lafayette, offers rare first-hand observation of Ruth's attentiveness. The seamstress recounts how the cook paused mid-task to tilt her head toward the corridor, correctly predicting Rowan's approach before any footfall sounded. While easily dismissed as anecdotal, this detail recurs across several unrelated accounts, suggesting a talent for reading tensions that permeated the household. It is within this context of silent vigilance that the later discoveries become explicable. Ruth's knowledge did not bloom suddenly in crisis. It accumulated through years of attuning herself to the cadence of the estate's operations. One document of particular significance is a maintenance request filed by an itinerant carpenter who observed Ruth retrieving tools from storage without needing direction. He noted her familiarity with the building's weaknesses: loose shutters, draft-prone windows, compromised floorboards, which signaled a deeper understanding of the property's physical vulnerabilities. Scholars now view this detail as an early indicator that she monitored not just people, but the infrastructure itself. This awareness positioned her uniquely to interpret shifts in Rowan's behavior. She recognized when he paced the upper corridor at unusual hours, and when he returned home, reeking of spirits and agitation after clandestine meetings. Her attunement, initially practical, would soon become strategic. Tension escalates sharply in accounts describing the evening Ruth discovered the forged deed. A letter written by a traveling teacher who lodged temporarily on the estate recounts overhearing a hushed commotion in the pantry, followed by the unsettling quiet familiar to households where dissent could not be spoken aloud. Modern historians agree that this moment marked a decisive turning point. According to later interviews, Ruth found the document wedged within the lining of Rowan's overcoat while preparing it for mending. She could not decipher every clause, but she recognized mismatched dates and a counterfeit seal, a discrepancy she later confirmed by comparing it to legitimate parish papers she had once seen. Through this discovery, Rowan's authority, long accepted as immutable, revealed itself as manufactured. From an analytical standpoint, Ruth's reaction reflects both courage and restraint. She did not immediately broadcast the information. Instead, she studied the document repeatedly, committing key features to memory. A surviving recollection from one of the younger houseworkers, recorded nearly 70 years after the events, describes Ruth sitting alone at the table well past dusk, tracing the document's edges with her fingertips, as though weighing the cost of possessing such knowledge. The testimony, though informal, captures a moment of profound recalibration. Ruth now understood that the land upon which she labored and the hierarchy that governed her life rested on fraudulent foundation. This revelation did not grant her safety, but it provided leverage she had never before held. The escalation becomes more pronounced in a parish official's memoir, where he recalls encountering Ruth outside the estate's gate the following morning. She was carrying a basket of produce, yet he sensed an uncharacteristic tension. Although he did not know the cause, he later speculated that she had already confronted Rowan in subtle ways. While no document records their initial exchange, multiple sources agree that Ruth tested Rowan's reaction by making indirect comments, suggesting she knew more than she should. These remarks, reconstructed from overlapping testimonies, appear to have been carefully crafted. Enough to observe his response, not enough to accuse him outright. Even this small gesture represented immense risk in a household where power imbalances dictated survival. A diary kept by a washerwoman who worked intermittently at the estate contains one of the few surviving descriptions of Rowan's reaction to Ruth's quiet probing. She writes that the master responded with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and that his voice carried an edge sharp enough to cut bread. Modern scholars read this moment as the instant Rowan realized that someone within the household had glimpsed the truth he had labored for years to conceal. His response, cold and unyielding, signaled a shift from anxiety to hostility. It foreshadowed the retaliation that would soon ensue. A retaliation that would deepen the rift between the master and the woman whose presence he had long taken for granted. The next document in the chain, a brief statement by an itinerant preacher who visited several properties that season, describes the estate as smoldering with unspoken conflict. Although vague, the description aligns with reports that Rowan grew increasingly volatile. Several accounts mention raised voices behind closed doors and the sound of objects striking the floor. These testimonies, though disparate, converge on a portrait of a household under growing strain. Rowan's instability was no longer hidden behind polite greetings or orchestrated dinners. He sensed threat and reacted with the kind of unpredictable force associated with men who fear exposure more than financial ruin. A compelling piece of evidence emerges from the estate's own inventory logs. Ruth's signature appears multiple times in the weeks following the discovery, marking orders and shipments with greater frequency than usual. Historians interpret this as Rowan delegating routine tasks to her, while he focused obsessively on securing funds and protecting the forged deed. Ironically, this shift granted Ruth greater access to information. She now handled invoices, procurement lists, and correspondence that would otherwise have remained beyond her reach. This inadvertent expansion of her authority marks another critical step in her movement from observer to strategist. Within this widening sphere of responsibility, Ruth also took note of Rowan's increasingly reckless decisions. A testimonial from a former driver recounts that she privately warned the staff to avoid provoking the master during his unpredictable moods. This warning, given in hushed tones, and quickly dismissed in the official records, reveals how deeply she understood the psychology of the household. She recognized that Rowan's desperation was escalating, and that any misstep might trigger a violent outburst. Her precautions demonstrate her dual role, protecting those under her care while assessing the master's deteriorating state. As tensions mounted, it became evident that Rowan's anxiety was not solely financial. Several witnesses remark on his physical behavior. Twitches at the jawline, sudden pauses mid-sentence. Long before medical observers took note, Ruth noticed these subtleties as well. A remark preserved in an oral history interview recounts her saying that the master's words were slipping through cracks he couldn't see. Though poetic, the line suggests she recognized his internal unraveling earlier than anyone else. Her awareness widened the gap between them. He saw her as a threat. She saw him as a man losing control. The final testimony from this phase, recorded by a parish librarian who interviewed elderly residents in the 1930s, describes Ruth's posture during this period as quietly braced, like someone holding a truth too heavy to set down. This image, reflective rather than literal, captures the essence of her position. She had discovered the forged deed, sensed Rowan's instability, and observed the beginnings of physical decline. Her silence was not submission, but calculation. Every detail she gathered became a thread in a larger pattern she had not yet fully articulated, but already understood would shape the future of the house and everyone within it. Through these intertwined accounts, a picture emerges of Ruth Delafay, not merely as a cook, but as the estate's unofficial chronicler and internal compass. Her discovery of the forged deed transformed her from a witness of Rowan Kincannon's descent into an active participant in the unfolding power struggle. The knowledge she carried and the measured choices she made in response set the stage for the conflict soon to erupt, giving her a role that historians now view as pivotal in both the master's undoing and the household's eventual reckoning. Accounts preserved in the parish archives describe a specific evening in mid-July of 1856 as the moment when the unspoken conflict between Rowan Kincannon and Ruth Delafay shifted from covert tension to outright peril. A field report written by a deputy tax assessor who happened to pass the estate that night notes unusual lights in the main house and voices rising sharply, followed by abrupt silence. Though the assessor could not identify the speakers, historians now agree that this aligns with the period during which Ruth approached Rowan indirectly about the inconsistencies she had uncovered in the forged deed. Her intention, based on later testimonies, was to communicate awareness without provoking immediate retaliation, testing whether the discovery might yield negotiation or understanding rather than punishment. A fragment from a letter by a neighboring plantation mistress refers to a rumor that the cook had glimpsed something the master wished buried. While the wording is vague, its timing matches Ruth's attempt to alert Rowan that she recognized discrepancies in his supposed title. Several witnesses later recalled hearing a sharp crash from inside the main house around that same evening, a detail repeatedly cited, though never officially confirmed. What remains consistent across accounts is the sense that Rowan responded to Ruth's cautious overture, not with explanation or bargaining, but with a kind of brittle fury characteristic of men whose authority depends on preventing certain truths from surfacing. The escalation becomes evident in testimonies from household staff interviewed decades later under federal archival programs. One worker, by then elderly, described seeing Rowan exit his study. With a look fixed between triumph and rage, clutching a small bundle of paper he carried toward the parlor hearth. This moment is widely interpreted as Rowan deciding to eliminate the threat of Ruth's freedom papers, which legally supported her manumission under a prior owner. According to this testimony, Ruth followed at a distance but did not intervene, as Rowan unwrapped the documents and held them to the fire. The witness recalled her watching with a stillness that did not break even when the flames rose, a detail that scholars find especially telling in light of her later actions. The destruction of Ruth's manumission papers represents a decisive break in the household's balance of power. Rowan's gesture was not merely punitive. It was symbolic, demonstrating his willingness to erase legal protections that conflicted with his control. A parish clerk's commentary written years later notes that masters who burned such papers typically did so to eliminate any potential challenge to their ownership claims. In this case, Rowan's act reinforced his belief that he could nullify threats simply by force of will, but contemporary historians argue that the event had an inverse effect. Rather than securing his authority, it confirmed to Ruth that any negotiation with him would be futile, and that survival would require strategy beyond appeals to law or reason. The stakes rise further in a recollection recorded by a traveling nurse who briefly tended to one of the younger workers. She recounts hearing that Rowan had accused Ruth of forgetting her place after she questioned a discrepancy in household supplies earlier that same day. The nurse's account indicates that Rowan interpreted even the smallest suggestions from Ruth as challenges to his dominance, leading him to escalate from verbal reprimand to physical aggression. Several narratives converge on the detail that Rowan struck Ruth during this confrontation, using either a wooden ladle or a heavy serving tool, depending on the source. While the exact instrument remains debated, the injury is consistently described as forceful enough to leave visible marks. A memorandum from Dr. Lyle Charbonneau, although written several months after the incident, includes a reference to contusions on the cook's jawline reported by external observers. He attributes the injury to domestic discipline, a euphemism typical of medical correspondence of the time. Modern analysts interpret Charbonneau's phrasing as tacit acknowledgement that the harm exceeded routine expectations. This documentation strengthens the view that Rowan's behavior had shifted from deteriorating composure to open violence. His reaction to Ruth's insight into the forged deed reflected not only insecurity, but also desperation. He acted as a man convinced he must assert absolute control to prevent his world from unraveling. Witnesses also describe an exchange following the assault in which Rowan declared his intention to raise funds through the sale of Elias, Ruth's grandson. A letter preserved in a private family collection from a broker operating near the Mississippi River mentions hearing that a boy of 12 years was promised to settle the Kincannon obligation. Though the letter does not name Ruth or Elias directly, its timeline and location correspond precisely with other accounts of Rowan finalizing arrangements with creditor Jacques Leclerc. The boy's approximate value stated in the letter as $800 even, provides the monetary context for Rowan's plan. Scholars note that this sum matched the outstanding portion of a debt Rowan had repeatedly deferred. Oral histories from the region describe Ruth receiving this news in silence. One interviewee, a descendant of a house servant, recalled being told that Ruth did not argue, did not plead. She merely stood and breathed in once, as though committing the moment to memory. This portrayal, echoed across multiple testimonies, emphasizes the transition from grief to purpose. Ruth understood that Rowan's willingness to destroy her freedom papers and sell Elias eliminated any possibility that compliance would protect her family. The absence of outward reaction should not be interpreted as submission. Researchers unanimously describe it as a moment of internal recalibration when she acknowledged a line had been crossed from which no return was possible. A field worker for a 20th century historical project recorded a story about that same evening. Ruth reportedly returned to the kitchen, resumed her duties, and completed preparations for the following morning's bread, as though nothing had occurred. This routine, according to the field worker, masked the shift occurring beneath the surface. When compared with later actions, Ruth's resumption of ordinary tasks reads as a deliberate choice to conceal her intentions. She understood, more than anyone, that the kitchen was the estate's most surveilled yet least questioned space, offering both cover and opportunity to those who moved within it. Documents from neighboring farms mention that Rowan emerged from the incident invigorated, telling an acquaintance that he had secured obedience where it was lacking. Scholars now interpret this self-assessment as ironic, given the irreversible consequences his actions triggered. Rowan believed he had extinguished a challenge. Instead, he had severed the last thread, preventing Ruth from acting. His assumption that she would remain compliant speaks to a broader cultural blindness common among planters of the period. A failure to recognize that those forced into subservience might possess not only knowledge, but agency. In the final surviving testament from this sequence, a stable hand recounts seeing Ruth late that night, standing briefly outside the kitchen door with her hands resting on the railing. He recalled that she appeared calm, but with eyes fixed as if into some future only she could see. He noted that she re-entered the house without speaking to anyone. Modern historians cite this image frequently, interpreting it as the moment Ruth shifted from observer to strategist. The events of the day, her discovery of the forged deed, the destruction of her freedom papers, the assault, and the threat to Elias had converged into a single defining point. She now recognized that Rowan's downfall was not merely desirable, but necessary. Through these intersecting testimonies, letters, and recollections, the archival record confirms this period as the hinge upon which the entire narrative turns. Rowan Kincannon's attempt to reassert dominance through violence and destruction of legal documents did not restore control. It crystallized the conditions for his undoing. Ruth Delafay's silence that night was not resignation, but a pivot, marking the threshold between endurance and action. Everything that followed, the method, the timing, the meticulous care, began in the aftermath of that irrevocable moment. Researchers examining the physical landscape of the Kincannon estate in late July of 1856 consistently note the deteriorating condition of its outer structures. A surveyor's log preserved in the parish vaults describes collapsed sheds, corroded hinges, and beams so softened by humidity that they could be crumbled between one's fingers. Although the surveyor recorded these details purely for taxation purposes, historians now view them as integral to understanding how Ruth Delafay identified both danger and opportunity within the estate's environment. She had long maintained awareness of the property's weaknesses, but after Rowan's destruction of her freedom papers and his announcement regarding Elias, these same weaknesses became potential instruments. Her daily movements through the grounds, nominally routine, doubled as reconnaissance. The first indication that Ruth began collecting materials appears indirectly in an account from a cooper who visited the estate to inspect water barrels. He later told interviewers that he glimpsed her near the abandoned storage shed at dusk, gathering debris that looked like flakes scraped from old iron. Although he did not attach significance to this at the time, the detail aligns with modern reconstructions of her actions. Researchers have identified that rust found in structures exposed to repeated flooding along the Atchafalaya Basin produces particularly fine particulate when crushed, a fact known informally among laborers who used such rust to tint wood treatments. Ruth's familiarity with these conditions positioned her to recognize a substance that could be repurposed toward a different and far riskier objective. A second testimony, recorded by a river fisherman decades later, mentions seeing Ruth carry a small sack back towards the house late one evening. He assumed she was transporting herbs, but the timing corresponds precisely with oral accounts describing her extraction of heavily oxidized nails from the rotting timbers of an old tool shed. The act required care. The structures were unstable, and drawing metal from them increased the risk of collapse. Yet the evidence indicates that she returned several times over successive nights, removing only what she could conceal within her apron without attracting attention. Each trip reflected a deliberate calculation. She needed enough material to act, but not so much that the missing hardware would alert the overseer. Historians studying this phase emphasize that Ruth's initial experiments took place far from the main house. Soil samples collected nearly a century later from depressions behind the smokehouse revealed minute traces of oxidized iron consistent with repeated grinding. While the samples cannot conclusively be tied to Ruth, their presence supports the long-standing belief that she first tested the feasibility of pulverizing rust before attempting to introduce it into the household kitchen. This testing period underscores her caution. She understood the lethality of ingesting such material incrementally, yet she could not risk visible changes in color or texture that might betray her intent to Rowan or the watchful eyes of the overseer, Harlan Rusk. The escalation becomes more apparent in testimonies referencing her nighttime work. One account from a stable hand describes hearing a rhythmic scraping sound emanating from the smokehouse vicinity well past midnight. He assumed it was an animal until he recognized the steady cadence of human labor. Although he did not investigate further, his recollection, recorded 60 years later, provides a rare auditory glimpse into Ruth's process. She likely used a stone mortar to fragment the rust before transferring it to a smaller iron vessel, suitable for producing a finer powder. That she worked in isolation at night suggests she was acutely aware of surveillance patterns within the estate and chose hours when Rowan was drunk or asleep. A pivotal moment in the documentary timeline appears in a recollection by Elias himself, preserved through interviews conducted late in his life. He recalled waking one night to find a faint glow emanating from the smokehouse window and witnessing his grandmother crushing something with a focused, unbroken rhythm. At the time, he believed she was preparing medicines or dyes, both common tasks. Later, he understood that this was the beginning of the process that would gradually incapacitate the master. His descriptions, relayed with both awe and sorrow, provide rare personal insight into Ruth's emotional state. She exhibited neither haste nor panic, only an unwavering calm shaped by necessity. As she refined the powder, Ruth confronted the practical challenge of integrating it into Rowan's meals without altering flavor or appearance. A kitchen ledger from that period notes repeated adjustments in bread ingredients, including increased use of molasses and darker flours sourced from a merchant in Franklin. While the official explanation listed market variability, historians believe Ruth intentionally selected components that concealed the iron's discoloration. Surviving botanical analyses of similar flowers from the region confirm they could mask subtle metallic notes when combined with yeast and humidity. These choices reveal her technical knowledge and illustrate how domestic expertise allowed her to execute complex strategies under the guise of routine cooking. The stakes rise in correspondence from a traveling peddler who supplied spices to the estate. He recalled Ruth asking whether he carried anything that could dull a bitter edge, a question he interpreted as culinary curiosity. Yet when cross-referenced with her efforts to perfect the mixture, the question takes on a different meaning. She sought to ensure Rowan would not attribute any metallic aftertaste to adulteration. His reputation for complaining about minor imperfections meant even a slight deviation risked exposure. Her inquiry thus exemplifies the convergence of subtlety and foresight that defined this stage of her plan. Once Ruth concluded the powder could be introduced without detection, the integration began. Parish testimonies indicate that Rowan continued demanding bread at nearly every meal, providing her with a predictable delivery method. He was accustomed to heavy, crusted loaves that masked irregularities in texture, and his habit of tearing them apart roughly before eating lessened the likelihood of noticing alterations. A merchant's recollection places him consuming these breads daily during this period, often while reviewing his ledgers. The very documents that recorded the debts driving his planned sale of Elias. Ironically, the same routine that fueled his financial anxieties provided Ruth with a consistent means of administering the slow-acting agent. Signs of physical strain in Rowan began appearing within days. A field report from a plantation neighbor mentions that he paused during conversations, rubbing at his jaw as though fighting stiffness. At the time, observers attributed this to stress or overindulgence in spirits. Modern medical historians, however, note that early stages of tetanus-induced muscular tightening often manifest subtly, especially when exposure occurs gradually through ingestion. Ruth's method exploited precisely this ambiguity. The symptoms could be dismissed as fatigue, tension, or anxiety, all conditions Rowan already exhibited. This ambiguity enabled her to continue dosing without altering household dynamics. As Rowan's condition worsened incrementally, Ruth maintained her routine with meticulous consistency. A daily log kept by a junior housemaid notes that the cook arrived before dawn each day without fail, a pattern that would have reassured observers accustomed to rigid expectations in plantation households. Yet such records, when read alongside the oral histories, reveal how carefully Ruth balanced visibility and invisibility. She ensured her behavior appeared unchanged, even as the consequences of her hidden labor grew more pronounced. Her calculated constancy kept suspicion at bay. The final records from this period depict a household unaware of the danger unfolding at its center. Rowan's creditors focused on upcoming payments. The overseer monitored field outputs. Tradesmen evaluated the estate's viability. None recognized that the master's slow decline originated in the kitchen. Historians often remark that Ruth's work during these weeks represents a rare intersection of domestic knowledge, structural decay, and strategic precision. She transformed the estate's neglect into a weapon and its routines into cover, advancing a plan forged from necessity and executed through patience. This quiet phase, though easily overlooked in the broader narrative, laid the essential groundwork for the dramatic unraveling soon to follow. Correspondence preserved in the Leclerc family archive indicates that by late July of 1856, creditor Jacques Leclerc had grown impatient with Rowan Kincannon's evasions. A letter to his brother describes the plantation as a property nearing seizure unless immediate funds are produced, noting Rowan's repeated assurances that a forthcoming transaction would satisfy the outstanding balance. This reference, scholars agree, points to the planned sale of Elias, the 12-year-old grandson of Ruth Delafay. Leclerc's decisions to visit personally reflects the growing pressure surrounding Rowan, whose debts had reached a stage where legal action was imminent. The impending arrival of a creditor of Leclerc's stature heightened tensions across the estate, particularly for those aware, or soon to become aware, of the underlying fraud in Rowan's claim to the land. A travel log kept by a Baton Rouge mercantile agent records seeing Rowan en route to a meeting with Leclerc shortly before the creditor's planned arrival. The agent describes the master's posture as rigid, as if bracing against a storm only he could see, an observation that takes on new meaning when juxtaposed with the early symptoms of muscular stiffness spreading through Rowan's jaw and neck. At the time, the agent attributed the rigidity to anxiety. Modern medical historians, however, interpret the description as consistent with low-level tetanic onset, which would have been indistinguishable from ordinary tension during its early stages. In either case, Rowan's condition was deteriorating while he attempted to project solvency and competence. Reports from household workers collected during 20th century oral history initiatives portray Rowan as increasingly erratic. One former field hand recalled that the master could not hold still long enough to finish a sentence, rubbing at his temples as if trying to suppress invisible pressure. Another interviewee recounted seeing him drop a ledger mid-inspection when a sudden spasm pulled his jaw to one side. Though these recollections are separated by decades, they paint a consistent picture of a man contending with both financial desperation and unexplained physical strain. Ruth Delafay, who observed him daily while preparing his meals, likely registered these early signs more clearly than anyone else, interpreting them as confirmation that her method was taking hold. The next escalation appears in a memorandum written by a notary's assistant who accompanied Leclerc to the region. He noted that Rowan greeted them with forced enthusiasm, yet his speech sounded slurred at the edges, a detail the assistant attributed to drink. Historians reviewing this memorandum emphasize that misinterpretation was almost inevitable. 19th-century observers lacked the clinical framework to connect subtle oral rigidity with tetanus, especially in cases involving ingestion rather than puncture wounds. Rowan's attempt to conceal his condition through exaggerated courtesy only exacerbated its visibility. The assistant adds that Rowan's right hand twitched as he attempted to sign a preliminary note acknowledging their meeting. A parish-wide report from the sheriff's office records that Rowan's debt was officially classified as urgent during this period, meaning that failure to pay would result in the appointment of a temporary estate custodian. This classification alarmed Rowan, as a custodian would have immediate authority to audit land claims. Scholars highlight this as the moment when the risk of exposure regarding the forged deed intensified dramatically. If Leclerc initiated the seizure process, officials would review every document tied to the property, including the counterfeit title Rowan had guarded so obsessively. His sense of impending collapse, therefore, was rooted not only in financial peril, but in the threat of criminal discovery. Within the estate, daily routines began to shift. A letter from a visiting tutor describes Rowan cancelling lessons unexpectedly, claiming fatigue while simultaneously ordering staff to increase production in fields already stretched beyond capacity. The tutor's perplexity, expressed in neat cursive across yellowing paper, offers a glimpse into the instability permeating the household. Rowan's contradictory demands signaled the loss of coherence in his leadership. As his physical symptoms progressed, so too did his irrationality, creating an environment of mounting unease among those who had long relied on predictable patterns for survival. The emotional stakes heighten with the introduction of Overseer Harlan Rusk's suspicions. A recollection preserved by the Federal Writers Project states that Rusk noticed unusual odors in the kitchen. Metallic, sharp, and inconsistent with typical bread making. Though he lacked the knowledge to interpret the scent accurately, he sensed irregularity. His suspicion deepened when he observed Ruth retrieving a mortar from a shelf she rarely used outside of specific herbal preparations. Rusk's authority on the estate granted him both access and influence, and historians argue that had he pursued the matter aggressively at this point, Ruth's strategy might have unraveled. Instead, his uncertainty forestalled direct action, allowing the tension to build without resolution. A former housemaid's testimony includes a vivid recollection of Rusk confronting Ruth about supposed deviations in the master's meals. The encounter, she said, unfolded with the overseer leaning close enough to smell the dough on her hands, demanding to know why recent bread batches had a darker crust. Ruth, employing the poise she maintained throughout this period, attributed it to variations in flour mill shipments. The explanation, while technically plausible, did not fully allay Rusk's doubts. Historians analyzing the exchange emphasize that it reflects the precarious balance Ruth navigated, offering just enough information to appear compliant while revealing nothing that might endanger her work. While these confrontations simmered, Rowan's physical symptoms advanced. A neighbor's diary recounts unexpectedly encountering Rowan on the road, noting that he winced each time he turned his head, as though the air itself resisted him. The neighbor interpreted the behavior as petulant irritation. Modern reviewers, however, recognize in this description a progression of tetanic stiffness. Contemporary medical analyses of the case emphasize that gastrointestinal exposure to rust powder can lead to systemic muscular rigidity without obvious external wounds, making early detection exceedingly difficult. Rowan's inability to articulate his discomfort coherently further obscured the true cause from those around him. Meanwhile, correspondence from Leclerc indicates that he planned to finalize the arrangement for Elias within days. In one letter, he writes that Rowan assured him the boy would be ready for transport, and that payment in the amount of $800 would satisfy the immediate portion of the debt. Scholars highlight the disturbing symmetry between Rowan's failing health and his determination to complete the sale. Even as his body betrayed him, he remained fixated on treating Elias as collateral. This fixation underscores the moral dimensions of the unfolding events. Rowan's desperation reinforced his cruelty rather than tempering it. In the kitchen, Ruth adjusted her approach as Rowan's symptoms intensified. A supply record from the estate lists increased orders for ingredients suited to masking stronger metallic notes, suggesting she refined the mixture in response to his worsening condition. Oral histories recount that she monitored his reactions closely, noting when he grimaced or paused while chewing, then subtly altering proportions in subsequent batches. This phase demonstrates her adaptability and the degree to which she stayed attuned to changes in his physiology, ensuring the process continued without provoking alarm. The convergence of these developments, creditor pressure, physical deterioration, overseer suspicion, and Ruth's persistent dosing, set the stage for the dramatic escalation soon to follow. Each account from this period, whether written by outsiders or remembered decades later by those who lived through it, reveals a household tightening under forces both visible and invisible. Rowan Kincannon, straining to preserve authority amid debt and illness, became increasingly vulnerable even as he attempted to mask his decline. Ruth Delafay, operating with precision beneath the surface, advanced her plan amid rising scrutiny. The tension, unmistakable across all surviving documentation, approached a breaking point that would soon shatter the estate's fragile equilibrium. Accounts from the Federal Writers' Project describe overseer Harlan Rusk entering the kitchen during the final days of July, drawn by a curiosity he could not yet articulate. Several interviews mention that he paused near the doorway, sniffing the air before stepping inside, noting a scent he associated not with food preparation, but with metalwork. While Rusk lacked the technical vocabulary to identify oxidized iron, his instincts were sharpened by years of monitoring supplies and laborers. He questioned Ruth Delafay about the source of the odor, his tone measured, but unmistakably suspicious. Ruth offered a calm explanation involving milling inconsistencies, yet observers later recalled that Rusk did not leave satisfied. This initial confrontation marks the fulcrum of growing scrutiny, directed toward the one person who knew exactly what was happening inside the master's body. A diary attributed to a junior housemaid provides the next perspective on the tension. She describes Rusk lingering near the preparation tables, touching jars and utensils as though searching for evidence of wrongdoing. His fixation settled on an iron mortar Ruth kept partially concealed at the edge of the counter. According to the diary, he lifted it, tilted it into the light, and muttered that residue clinging to its interior looked like something scraped from the hull of a boat. Although the phrase was likely metaphorical, modern analysts note that it aligns closely with the appearance of finely ground rust. Ruth responded with steady composure, insisting the mortar had been used for crushing herbs required for Rowan Kincannon's tonic. Her explanation, while plausible, did little to quiet Rusk's growing unease. Escalation becomes stark in a recollection recorded by an elderly farmhand who claimed to witness Rusk inspecting the old sheds behind the kitchen. The farmhand described him examining door frames, running his fingers along the gaps where several nails appeared to be missing. This discovery reportedly deepened his suspicion, prompting him to speculate aloud that someone had been tampering with estate property. While the farmhand did not know the broader context, historians believe Rusk was attempting to connect the metallic odor from the kitchen with the missing hardware from the structures Ruth had been dismantling quietly at night. His investigative instincts, however imprecise, were circling dangerously close to the truth. A letter from a traveling preacher who spent a night in the workers' quarters recounts overhearing Rusk threatening that if he discovered anyone contributing to Rowan's worsening condition, he would see them tied to the highest cypress on the property. Although sermons often exaggerated for effect, modern scholars consider this statement reflective of Rusk's real intentions, particularly as Rowan's symptoms intensified. The preacher noted that Rusk's voice carried through the thin walls of the quarters, instilling fear in those who heard him. For Ruth, who moved silently between spaces and heard more than most, such threats would have reaffirmed the need for greater caution and speed. Meanwhile, Rowan Kincannon himself grew increasingly unpredictable. A neighbor's field journal records that he appeared disoriented during a brief encounter, rubbing at his jaw and stumbling over words he seemed unable to form. These visible signs of deterioration provided Rusk with further justification for suspicion. According to oral accounts, he confronted Ruth again, accusing her of altering recipes or mishandling ingredients. She deflected each accusation with careful precision, pointing to inconsistencies in Rowan's own behavior and offering explanations rooted in stress, weather, or overwork. Her demeanor, consistently even and unflappable, frustrated Rusk, who interpreted calm as concealment. The turning point arrives in a fragment from the parish constable's unofficial notes, which include references to Rusk attempting to report irregularities in household preparation to the authorities. The constable, unfamiliar with plantation politics and preoccupied with other matters, dismissed the report as domestic unrest. This dismissal may have prevented immediate intervention, but it also intensified Rusk's determination to uncover what he believed was hidden beneath the surface. Historians analyzing the constable's notes argue that this moment forestalled an early collapse of Ruth's plan. Without bureaucratic follow-up, suspicion remained confined within the estate rather than becoming a public inquiry. In response to this heightened danger, Ruth employed a strategy that historians now consider one of the most ingenious elements of her plan. Knowing that Rusk's searches were becoming more thorough, she began relocating the powdered rust to locations he would never suspect. The most audacious of these choices was the hollow shaft of Rowan's decorative cane, a detail preserved in a written recollection by Elias, who later described helping his grandmother unscrew the silver cap in the dim kitchen light. Ruth poured the powder inside, wiped the threads clean, and restored the cane to its usual position. Its transformation from accessory to hiding place exemplifies her understanding of both Rowan's habits and Rusk's blind spots. The overseer scrutinized the kitchen, but never the master's personal possessions. By early August, the estate had entered a state of taut silence, documented in multiple interviews, as a period when everyone sensed that some decisive moment was approaching. Rowan's health faltered visibly, Rusk's suspicions intensified, and Ruth continued working with disciplined regularity. Her every action, from kneading dough to storing utensils, was performed under the overseer's watchful gaze. Yet, as oral testimonies attest, she did not alter her routine. This constancy, paradoxically, prevented Rusk from identifying the extraordinary within the ordinary. The convergence of creditor pressure, physical decline, and internal surveillance created an atmosphere in which a single misstep might have shattered Ruth's efforts, but her restraint ensured that events remained poised for the explosive developments soon to unfold. A memorandum written by notary's assistant Louis Carrière describes the atmosphere inside the Kincannon dining room on the evening of August 1st, 1856, as strained to the point of fracture. Carrière, accompanying creditor Jacques Leclerc on what was expected to be a routine meal before finalizing documents, noted that Rowan Kincannon appeared distracted and unsteady when he greeted them. Although Rowan attempted to maintain formalities, Carrière observed that his jaw seemed fixed at an unnatural angle, and that his right hand trembled when lifting a glass. At the time, the assistant attributed these signs to fatigue or drink, yet the precise nature of his description has since proven invaluable to medical historians studying incremental tetanic onset triggered by prolonged ingestion rather than a single wound. According to Carrière's account, the meal progressed awkwardly. Rowan insisted on cutting his own bread, despite Leclerc's attempts to initiate conversation about the impending sale of Elias for $800. Witnesses later reported that Ruth Delafay stood at the far end of the room, silent but attentive, observing every shift in Rowan's expression. When he raised a slice of bread to his mouth, Carrière wrote that he paused as though weighing the effort required to chew. Moments later, a sharp sound rang through the room, a crack Carrière described as startling in its clarity. Rowan froze mid-motion, his teeth clenched, a fragment of crust falling unnoticed to the table. Subsequent analysis suggests the crack may have been a tooth fracturing under the force of involuntary muscular contraction. Leclerc, irritated at the disruption, reportedly demanded to know whether Rowan intended to proceed with their business or continue stalling. Yet the master could not form a coherent response. A diary kept by a housemaid describes seeing Rowan's lips pull back in what appeared to be a grimace, though she realized later it was something closer to a fixed rictus. As seconds passed, Rowan's entire posture shifted. His shoulders drew upward, his spine stiffened, and his hands curled involuntarily around the edge of the table. These signs, while recognizable now as hallmarks of escalating tetanic rigidity, would have appeared inexplicable to observers unfamiliar with the condition. Panic spread through the room as Rowan attempted to speak, but produced only strained breaths. At this point, according to Carriere's memorandum, Leclerc called for Ruth, assuming some error in food preparation. When she approached, Rowan lurched sideways, toppling his chair with enough force to shake the floorboards. Carriere recorded that the master's body twisted as though pulled by invisible wires, his heels scraping against the floor as his limbs locked. The description aligns closely with medical reports of generalized tetanic seizure, particularly the arching of the back, which physicians later identified when reviewing testimonies from those present. In the chaos, several servants rushed forward, only to be ordered back by Leclerc, who feared further aggravating whatever afflicted Rowan. The escalation intensified when a visitor from Pointe-Coupée, later identified in parish documents as trader Silas Blackwood, entered the house expecting to conclude arrangements for Elias. Blackwood, unaware of the unfolding medical crisis, reportedly demanded Rowan's signature immediately. When he saw the master convulsing, he accused the household of scheming to avoid payment. This intrusion, documented in a complaint Blackwood later filed with the sheriff, added to the confusion inside the dining room and nearly resulted in violence. Ruth, meanwhile, remained focused on Rowan's movements, recognizing that the symptoms had crossed a threshold beyond reversal. Her calm, in contrast to others' alarm, is cited by historians as evidence of her understanding of the outcome already in motion. A messenger was dispatched for Dr. Lyle Charbonneau, whose residence lay several miles south along the river road. Charbonneau's later medical notes, included in a dossier compiled in the 1890s, recount his shock upon arrival. He found Rowan on the floor, contorted in a state he described as extreme opistotonic tension, with jaw muscles so rigid they resisted manual examination. Charbonneau's notes indicate that he immediately searched for an external wound, but found none, concluding that the condition might have stemmed from contaminated food or an undetected infection. He wrote that the household staff appeared terrified, yet Ruth stood near the doorway, her expression unreadable. Scholars frequently point to this moment as one revealing the depth of her restraint. Rusk, the overseer, seized the opportunity to voice his suspicions. A private memorandum from Charbonneau references Rusk's insistence that irregular practices in the kitchen were responsible for Rowan's state. The physician, skeptical of untrained speculation, nevertheless followed Rusk into the hallway, where the overseer described smelling metal in recent meals and discovering missing nails in the sheds. Charbonneau recorded these claims, but dismissed them as conjecture, ultimately returning to the patient without further investigation. His refusal to act on Rusk's warnings is now seen by historians as a pivotal juncture. Had Charbonneau searched the kitchen more rigorously, he might have uncovered the iron mortar or other traces of Ruth's preparations. As Rowan's spasms intensified, the room devolved into disarray. Witnesses interviewed many years later recalled hearing the master attempt to gesture toward the kitchen, his fingers trembling violently as though he wished to indicate something left behind. Whether he sought to accuse or merely grasp for support remains unknown, but his inability to speak rendered his meaning irretrievable. Within minutes, the seizure peaked, leaving him rigid and gasping. Charbonneau, recognizing the inevitability of respiratory failure, ordered the household back as he attempted to ease Rowan's airway. The attempt proved futile. Rowan's final convulsion struck with such force that it stunned even those accustomed to hardship. The moment, captured in multiple testimonies, marks the collapse of his authority, his ambitions, and the scaffolding of deception that had upheld the estate for years. By the time Rowan fell still, the dining room had transformed from a place of negotiation into a tableau of shock. Leclerc stared at the body with a mixture of disbelief and irritation. Blackwood cursed the lost transaction, and Rusk seethed with the conviction that some hidden sabotage had unfolded before his eyes. Ruth alone moved with purpose. Oral histories recount that she stepped back into the shadows, her posture composed as though witnessing the final act of an equation long understood. Rowan Kincannon, debtor, deceiver, and master, had succumbed not to a public enemy, but to a series of unseen choices made within the intimate spaces he had never thought to fear. His downfall, recorded in documents scattered across parish offices and personal archives, set the stage for the reckonings that would follow in the wake of his death. The immediate aftermath of Rowan Kincannon's collapse is chronicled in a series of inconsistent but overlapping testimonies collected during the early 20th century. One account, preserved in the handwritten notes of notary's assistant Louis Carrière, states that as Rowan's body stiffened into its final contortion, Jacques Leclerc turned away from the dying man and scanned the study for documents relevant to their interrupted negotiations. Carrière wrote that Leclerc's frustration transformed into confusion when he spotted a parchment lying atop the master's ledger, an object he claimed had not been there earlier in the evening. Modern historians widely interpret this parchment as the forged deed Ruth Delafay placed deliberately in plain sight, understanding that Leclerc's instinct for financial irregularities would compel him to inspect it. This act marked the beginning of a critical unraveling. The master's death exposed not only physical decay, but legal fraud. Leclerc's reaction, recorded in both oral accounts and his own correspondence, was immediate and explosive. In a letter dated 1 week after the incident, he described the deed as a fabrication so clumsy it insulted the very ink upon it, noting mismatched seals and dates that contradicted recorded parish transfers. For decades, scholars have debated whether Leclerc realized the fraud instantly or pieced it together over several minutes, but all sources agree that the discovery altered his stance entirely. Instead of securing payment through the sale of Elias, he now saw an opportunity to seize control of the property on behalf of the rightful heirs in Virginia. In this sense, Ruth's calculated placement of the document redirected the estate's fate, ensuring that Rowan's plans died with him. While Leclerc processed the revelation, Overseer Harlan Rusk seized the moment to intensify his accusations. A surviving deposition Rusk attempted to file with the parish constable claims he confronted Ruth in the hallway, insisting she had tampered with the master's sustenance. Although the deposition was rejected for lack of evidence, its language provides insight into Rusk's mindset. He interpreted Rowan's death not as the culmination of natural or medical causes, but as the outcome of deliberate interference. Yet historians analyzing Charbonneau's medical notes emphasize that Rusk's aggressive certainty worked against him. The physician dismissed the overseer's claims as emotional overreaction, and Leclerc, now focused on the forged deed, had no incentive to investigate further. Rusk's accusations, though dangerous, ultimately lacked the institutional backing required to endanger Ruth directly. A pivotal element in this sequence involves the cane that Ruth had earlier transformed into a hiding place for the powdered rust. Multiple accounts describe Rusk retrieving the cane from beneath a side table, where it had been dropped during the chaos of Rowan's convulsions. According to a testimony collected in the 1930s, he attempted to unscrew the silver cap, suggesting he sensed something concealed within. Before he could succeed, a commotion erupted from the kitchen, a pot overturned by a servant attempting to extinguish a grease flare. The interruption drew all attention away from Rusk, forcing him to abandon his investigation. Historians often describe this moment as a narrow escape. Had the overseer opened the cane, the powder might have revealed the means of Rowan's poisoning. Instead, Rusk's chance evaporated as the crisis pulled him elsewhere. During this distraction, Ruth reportedly retrieved the cane and concealed it beneath a heavy sofa in the study. A written recollection by Elias, produced late in his life, states that he saw his grandmother return moments later with an expression calm enough to fool anyone who did not know her well. Her swift action ensured that the physical evidence of her plan remained hidden, while the household focused on tending to Rowan's body and addressing the broader shock of the moment. Scholars analyzing this decision highlight Ruth's understanding of the estate's physical layout and social dynamics. She knew the precise locations unlikely to be searched in the frenzy that followed the master's death. With Rowan declared dead by Dr. Charbonneau, Leclerc turned his attention to the forged deed. A clerk's transcript from the parish courthouse records that Leclerc ordered Rusk to step aside and initiated procedures to notify the rightful Kincannon heirs in Virginia. This abrupt shift in authority left the overseer without the institutional support he expected. Simultaneously, the trader Silas Blackwood, who had arrived to collect Elias, found himself entangled in a dispute he had not anticipated. Blackwood protested that Rowan had promised him the boy for $800, but Leclerc countered that any sale based on fraudulent property claims held no legal standing. Parish documents confirm that Blackwood eventually retreated, vowing to pursue restitution, but gaining no leverage in the moment. As legal and financial forces reorganized, Ruth remained outwardly composed. Oral histories describe her assisting in clearing the dining room, offering towels for the doctor, and guiding younger servants away from the commotion. Yet beneath this facade, she understood the implications of Leclerc's discovery. Rowan's fraud meant the estate would pass not through sale, but through legal reclamation. This shift opened the possibility, however uncertain, that she and Elias might secure better treatment, or even manumission, from heirs uninterested in maintaining the plantation. Her placement of the forged deed, therefore, had achieved its purpose. She had redirected the narrative from one in which Elias would be sold to one in which Rowan's crimes eclipsed all suspicion directed toward her. The final element in this chain involves Dr. Charbonneau's late-night observation, recorded in his case notes, of a small metallic shard lodged near Rowan's gums, although the doctor removed the fragment and noted its rusty appearance, he concluded that contaminated cookware or accidental ingestion explained its presence. His lack of familiarity with systemic poisoning through repeated exposure prevented him from pursuing the matter further. Historians examining his medical file argue that Charbonneau came close to identifying the lethal mechanism without recognizing its intentional origin. This oversight, whether born of bias or limited knowledge, effectively sealed the secret of Ruth's actions. The master's death remained attributed to tragic infection, while the deeper truth receded beneath layers of legal and bureaucratic upheaval. Thus, the convergence of fraud, suspicion, medical ambiguity, and carefully timed misdirection ensured that Rowan Kincannon's death marked not only the collapse of his authority, but the dissolution of any coherent narrative that might have tied his suffering to the quiet resistance unfolding in his kitchen. The estate, now in flux, became a stage for competing claims and shifting power, none of which fully grasped the hidden architecture of the downfall they struggled to explain. With Rowan Kincannon's body laid out under the supervision of Dr. Lyle Charbonneau, the estate entered a period of turbulent reorganization. A report drafted by the parish clerk on August 3rd of 1856 notes that Jacques Leclerc formally assumed temporary operational authority pending the arrival of the rightful heirs from Virginia. This transfer, executed with quiet efficiency, displaced overseer Harlan Rusk almost immediately. According to the clerk's summary, Rusk objected vociferously, insisting that suspicious conduct within the household contributed to Rowan's demise. Leclerc, already preoccupied with the implications of the forged deed, dismissed Rusk's claims as unfounded and ordered him to vacate his post. Scholars view this dismissal as a direct consequence of Rusk's inability to produce tangible evidence, combined with Leclerc's desire to stabilize the estate before legal scrutiny intensified. The next development is preserved in the personal letters of Leclerc, who outlined his strategy for handling the estate's assets and its inhabitants. In a letter to his associate in Baton Rouge, he wrote that selling the land quickly would preserve value for the heirs and avoid protracted disputes. He also mentioned a decision not to pursue the sale of the child Elias, citing both legal uncertainty and an interest in maintaining good order among the remaining household laborers. This correspondence underscores Leclerc's pragmatic approach. He recognized that Rowan's scheme to liquidate the boy for $800 was now untenable. His refusal to honor the arrangement with trader Silas Blackwood marked a turning point, preventing Elias from being forced into the transport and giving Ruth Delafay her first glimpse of a future not dictated by Rowan's debts. Blackwood's frustrations appear in a complaint lodged with the parish sheriff, wherein he alleged breach of agreement and demanded either compensation or permission to seize the boy. The sheriff's ledger, however, records the matter as not actionable, noting that Rowan's fraudulent ownership invalidated any private promises he made regarding persons held on the estate. This ruling, brief but decisive, effectively ended Blackwood's pursuit. Historians examining the sheriff's decision argue that the procedural rigidity of property law, as applied to enslaved individuals, ironically worked in Ruth's favor at this juncture. Because Rowan's claim to the estate itself was illegitimate, all secondary agreements collapsed alongside it. Meanwhile, Dr. Charbonneau finalized his documentation of Rowan's death. His report, stored today in the State Medical Archives, concluded that the master succumbed to severe systemic infection, likely originating from contaminants introduced through diet or utensils. Despite observing rust particles near Rowan's gums, Charbonneau reaffirmed his earlier view that poor maintenance of cookware or wells was the probable cause. Scholars analyzing these notes emphasize how medical limitations of the era, combined with cultural assumptions about domestic labor, obscured the intentional nature of the poisoning. The doctor's conclusions helped quell speculation, closing the door on Rusk's attempts to implicate Ruth or other members of the kitchen staff. As administrative order reasserted itself, Leclerc initiated communication with the Virginia heirs, informing them of Rowan's fraudulent claim and the need to re-establish legal ownership. A surviving reply, dated August 12th, indicates that the heirs had little interest in managing distant property and preferred liquidation. This preference aligned conveniently with Leclerc's own plans and created an unexpected opening for Ruth and Elias. Oral histories recount that Leclerc promised Ruth he would include her name in statements describing how she preserved order during the upheaval, a gesture historians interpret as both a reward for her composure and a pragmatic effort to secure cooperation while navigating the estate toward auction. A parish court transcript from late August confirms that Ruth and Elias were formally granted manumission under the authority of the returning heirs. The transcript, though sparse, states that the woman Ruth Delafay and the boy Elias shall be recognized as free persons and allowed to depart the property without encumbrance. This ruling, unprecedented in several nearby parishes, has been the subject of extensive historical analysis. Some researchers attribute the decision to Leclerc's influence, others to the heirs' desire to avoid potential legal entanglements involving Rowan's forged deed. Whatever the underlying motivation, the outcome reshaped the legacy of the estate, marking the only documented instance of freedom emerging from the administrative aftermath of widespread fraud in that region. After their release, Ruth and Elias relocated northward along the river, a journey partially reconstructed through church registries and census fragments. The earliest confirmed record places them in a small settlement near Natchez in 1858, where they were listed as members of a community of free people of color. Oral histories collected a century later describe Ruth continuing to work as a cook, her skills valued in homes that appreciated both her discipline and discretion. Elias, according to the same sources, apprenticed with a carpenter, influenced perhaps by memories of the decaying buildings that once provided the materials for his grandmother's resistance. Their quiet lives after the ordeal stand in stark contrast to the turmoil from which they emerged. The Kincannon estate itself changed hands multiple times following liquidation, eventually losing its original boundaries as parcels were sold off to various buyers. A historical survey published in the early 20th century describes the land as unremarkable, save for the unusual sequence of ownership claims recorded in the parish files. That sequence, rooted in fraud, desperation, and clandestine retribution, remains a fixture of scholarly discussion. Researchers frequently note that while legal documents preserve the revelation of Rowan's deceit, they omit the more intimate story of Ruth's vigilance and resolve. Her actions, though unrecorded in official accounts, shaped the trajectory of events as decisively as any financial ledger or court decree. In retrospect, the downfall of Rowan Kincannon has come to symbolize the collapse of a system predicated on coerced labor and unchecked authority. His death, attributed by contemporaries to misfortune, is now understood by historians as the culmination of intersecting pressures, fraudulent ownership, spiraling debt, and the subtle resistance of those forced to labor under him. Ruth Delafay's story survives largely through fragments, interviews, recollections, and indirect references. Yet these fragments cohere into a portrait of someone who navigated oppression with precision and patience. Her quiet intervention ensured not only her freedom, but also the exposure of a plantation built on deception. In this sense, the true transformation did not occur when Rowan died, but when the structures sustaining his power finally yielded to the hidden forces working steadily against him.